Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club as we continue our reading of The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed, the true and unforgettable story of faith and miraculous deliverance in communist China at the height of the Cultural Revolution, written by Stanley Maxwell. In our last reading, we covered chapters 6 and 7, where Mr. Wang chose to resign his job as a guard outside the garment factory because, as a Christian, he refused to take bribes anymore and wanted Saturdays off so he could keep the Sabbath holy. He got another job as a supervisor of security inside the same garment factory. By now, the government of China had been taken over by the Mao Zedong Communist Party, and life was changing rapidly in China. Mr. Wang, however, continued his Christian witnessing activities and church-going. He soon paid the price and was reported to the police, who arrested him, forcing him to write out a confession and report his fellow Christians, colleagues, and church members. Mr. Wang betrayed none of them, but instead used the time to report his conversion to Christianity. Although he was eventually released, as soon as he arrived home, the police raided his home and searched it and arrested him again as a spy and a traitor. His family was left alone with his wife suffering from tuberculosis. We continue our reading today with chapters 8 and 9, respectively entitled News of the End of the World and Fasting and a Basket of Eggs. We begin with chapter 8, News of the End of the World. Mr. Wang's face felt puffy and swollen from a beating the night before. A guard grasped his hair, forcing his head downward, symbolizing his submission to the people's will. Power in the judge's hands, more valuable to the party than money, would decide whether a prisoner lived or died. Mr. Wang's legs ached from being forced to stand during days of interrogation. He longed to sit, but he knew that he must stand throughout the trial. His body felt like one enormous bruise. He'd waited long for trial, enduring anxious prison days. Now the time had come. He was in court at last. That in itself brought some relief, for something could be decided. "Criminal Wang," the judge said in a monotone, "you are a supervisor at the Shanghai Province Garment Industrial Office, is that correct?" "Correct," Mr. Wang replied. "We have evidence that you're also a Kuomintang spy." Recent newspapers had featured the execution of nationalist spies. Crowds had watched their fellow Chinese, accused of treason, being shot in the head. Unless proven innocent, Mr. Wang knew the judge's charge could mean his death. A guard yanked on Mr. Wang's hair, pulling his neck back so he could answer the judge. Despite the jerk, he managed to speak firmly. "I'm not a spy." "I hear you've been talking about Jesus." Mr. Wang looked into the judge's stern face and said, "Jesus is my best friend." Laughing, the judge jostled some papers on his desk. "Here's proof that you're rumor-mongering about the end of New China." He held up a notebook that the police had confiscated from his house the night of the raid, and a copy of The Spirit of Prophecy by Ellen G. White. The judge read a quotation Mr. Wang had clipped from Arthur S. Maxwell's book, The Atomic Bomb and the Last Day of the World. "You want us destroyed by an atomic bomb. Is that what you mean by the end of the world?" Mr. Wang knew that by world, the judge meant China's Middle Kingdom, not the entire globe. "I don't think of atomic destruction," Mr. Wang replied. I don't want anyone killed by the atomic bomb. Jesus wants to rescue everyone. All who follow the testaments will be saved, for they tell us to be good, not bad. You're very cunning. Of course, we all know this Jesus is a code for Chiang Kai-shek, and you are a running dog for the feudalistic nationalist government. The face of the judge resembled stone, void of expression. He spoke with power. Are you going to stop talking this treacherous nonsense? I can't stop talking about Jesus, who is my good friend, if that's what you mean. Then you're a traitor, the judge shouted. I'm a Christian. So was Chiang Kai-shek, the judge retorted. He betrayed the People's Party. Admit it. You want Chiang Kai-shek to return, not Jesus. You're a Kuomintang spy. Confess. I'll confess my religion. Mr. Wang thought of how Paul, on trial before kings, witnessed for his faith. Perhaps God had brought him to the court so this judge could learn of the spiritual struggle for his mind. If you read my clippings about the end of the world, you will see quotations from the Bible and Ellen White's book, The Conflict Between Good and Evil. That's code for the conflict between the Kuomintang and the Red Army, the judge interrupted. You think that counter-revolutionary Chiang Kai-shek is good, and that our great helmsman, Chairman Mao, is evil. Admit it. A guard jerked Mr. Wang's hair on the back of his neck, snapping his head backward, and shouted, You're a spy who's guilty of rumor-mongering. Admit it. The roots of Mr. Wang's hair stung his neck, but he defended himself. I'm not rumor-mongering. Where did you get this book? It's published in Hong Kong. You're distributing reactionary propaganda that goes against the will of the people. When the judge said people, he really meant the communist government under Chairman Mao. Mr. Wang replied, I wrote to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Hong Kong branch, requesting a copy. They sent one to me. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is connected with the American Emperor, which means you spy for the enemy. Admit it. Mr. Wang reaffirmed, I have no connection with America, and the message in my notebook is not rumor-mongering. Then what's the message? The judge asked with a feigned politeness. The conflict between good and evil tells of the battle between Christ and Satan for the control of this planet, not just China. Seventh-day Adventists believe that its author, Ellen White, was a prophet who wrote messages for our church in the last days. Her book and the Bible predict what will happen before Jesus returns. I asked about your reactionary notebook. The judge held it up. What does Ellen White have to do with this? The newspaper clippings I posted in the book are stories showing how her predictions and those in the Bible are coming true. I'm not a spy, but a true Christian who's a Seventh-day Adventist deacon in Shanghai. I believe the teachings of the Old and New Testament and Ellen White. I know the Chinese Constitution guarantees freedom of religion. When I compiled my notebook before my arrest, I was exercising my constitutional rights. Seventh-day Adventists in China believe the Bible and the writings of Ellen White. We believe in the soon coming of Jesus, the end of the world, and celebrating the Sabbath. My notebook is legal according to the Chinese Constitution. So I appeal to you. Do your constitutional duty and release me. The judge turned the pages of the notebook. You seem loyal to the government, Comrade Wang. Your appeal to the constitutional right of religious freedom is justified. Therefore, the People's Party will drop the charges and release you. But I warn you, proselytizing is illegal, and therefore, bourgeois liberalization. Don't talk about Jesus, Ellen White, or the end of the world to anyone. Keep your beliefs to yourself. Mr. Wang's feet seemed not to touch the street as he walked home a free man. The real God had overruled. Soon he'd see his wife. He could raise his children as Christians, provide for their needs with his salary at the government factory, serve as a church deacon, and tell everyone about the end of the world. First, he needed to share the story of God's victory in court with a friend and a fellow church member, Professor Lee. Reaching up behind the metal house number at the top of the door, Mr. Wang pressed the doorbell hidden behind the number. 13-year-old Wan Lee opened the door and welcomed Mr. Wang. The professor sat in the living room, preparing for his next English class. I've got a story to tell you, Mr. Wang announced. He loved storytelling. Vividly, Mr. Wang described every detail. The raid at his home and the discovery of the notebook, the arrest, the trial with his defense, and the release. God wanted me to witness to the communists like Paul, Mr. Wang exclaimed. You were accused of spying? The professor asked. That's right. Mr. Wang sat in a chair. But the Lord was with me. I'm sure the trial was God's plan. You're a marked man. Maybe you should be more careful. Mr. Wang searched his fellow church member's face and asked, Did Peter quiet down when the priest forbade him to preach Christ's resurrection? My arrest is another proof that we live in the end of time. He paused and smiled. It's my duty to proclaim from the highest mountain that Jesus is coming soon. He tipped his head, brought the side of his hand against his neck, and feigned chopping it off. I don't care if the government cuts off my head, he said. I won't stop. The end of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Fasting and a basket of eggs. The house seemed bare as Mr. Wang looked for something he could pawn. He had sold 3 watches to the communists cheaply. That money was gone. A man from the factory had offered him only 2 renminbi for his purple copper heater. That cash, too, was spent. His pay had been cut sharply, and he also lost his bonus because he wouldn't work on Saturday at the garment factory. Since he persisted in attending church, the government punished him by lowering his pay to 35 renminbi, which was impossible to live on. 2 years after his arrest in 1950, a third daughter, Little Doll, was born. He cherished his youngest daughter, who was as beautiful as her name. Unfortunately, she contracted a nerve disorder at age 2. She had spent months in the hospital until Mr. Wang had insisted, against the doctor's advice, on taking her home. The doctors claimed she would die without proper medical care, but Mr. Wang had faith that God would heal her. At home, she did not die, but miraculously began recovering. However, she was another mouth to feed, and he had less money. How could he manage? Then an idea struck him. Sitting beside his wife's bed, he confessed, I have no money for food. Maybe I can ask Mr. Shu to loan me some money until I get paid. Lou objected. You claim to be a Christian and want a good reputation. If you borrow money and then can't pay it back, you'll give Christianity a bad name. Even if we have no food, we can't borrow money. Mr. Wong agreed and knelt beside his wife's bed. Shall we pray about it? If you think it'll do some good, his wife smiled. He prayed. My friend Jesus, you told us in Matthew not to worry about what we eat or drink. You promised that your Father knows everything I need. Tomorrow is Sabbath. I want it to be special for my children. I'm leaving everything in your hands. That night, he didn't sleep well, worrying about the health and survival of his children. The weight of his youngest daughter, Little Doll, bore down on Mr. Wong's shoulders the next day as he walked past the row of sycamores that led from the church to his home. Lee, Mei Mei, and Lin tagged along behind his wife, Lou. Love made his burden light because he valued the family time on the walk. Little Doll's small legs weren't strong enough to endure long walks at his pace, though he had slowed it to fit Lou's weakness. Little Doll's previous bout with pleurisy, emphysema, and other complications, collectively diagnosed as a type of tuberculosis, occasionally caused spasms and loss of coordination, so he often carried her. Her weight seemed insignificant compared to the mental and spiritual weight he carried that afternoon. Little Doll reached out her hand and covered his face. He pulled it away from his eyes, not wanting to run into the pedestrians who crowded the sidewalk. Daddy, Little Doll said, I'm hungry. What are we going to eat when we get home? Mr. Wong looked at his wife and felt sad. His stomach growled, for the walk added to his healthy appetite. He thought about his prayer the night before and answered, I'm sorry, Little Doll, but right now we have no food. Why, Daddy? Because when Daddy takes the family to church, the factory docks my salary. The government hopes to force me to stop worshiping. That's why sometimes you don't have enough money to buy food. Is today one of those sometimes? Little Doll asked. Yes, dear. That means we can't eat today, doesn't it? The family trudged along in silence for several blocks. Mr. Wong wondered which system his children preferred, communism or Christianity. He feared that hunger might persuade them that the communists had a point. Suspecting that Little Doll would whine, he sent up a prayer for an answer. His daughter broke the silence. Daddy, I remember we read about fasting in the Bible. Didn't it say that it's a good thing to choose a day not to eat any food and fast? Yes, Mr. Wong replied. We all sat around Mama's bed for evening worship while I read what the Bible says about fasting to keep the mind clear when praying. We have no food, so why not call this a fast day? Praise the Lord, Mr. Wong exclaimed. God must have inspired you to say that. Out of the mouth of babes. Courage replaced his gloom. If he were arrested and separated from his family, that kind of faith would keep his children true. Yes, Little Doll, that's a good idea. We'll dedicate today as a fast day. What do the rest of you think? He looked from his wife to his son Lee, then to Mei Mei and Lin. Does everyone agree with Little Doll? Enthusiastically, they decided, let's fast. Immediately, the whole family seemed to stand a few millimeters taller, and the burden of placing one foot before the other lightened. Lee, Mei Mei, and Lin ran ahead instead of lagging behind. Even Lou seemed to walk faster. And fast they did. In the evening, they heard a knock. Surprised to see Mr. Shu, the man he had considered borrowing from, Mr. Wang invited him to join the family around Lou's bed. When he was about to leave, he handed an envelope to Mr. Wang. I felt impressed to give you this. After Mr. Shu left, Mr. Wang found 50 renminbi inside. Showing the money to his wife, Mr. Wang exclaimed, "It's a miracle. God has answered our prayer. Now we can eat, all because we were willing to fast." When times got tough, the family retold the story of when little Doll turned disaster into joy by suggesting a fast instead of grumbling. A knock on the door told Lou she had to drag herself out of bed and struggle down the corridor to open the door. Using all her energy, Lou realized tuberculosis had taken its toll. Exhaustion restricted her from cleaning house and cooking food, but she could still dress herself, though it took longer each day. She felt terrible that she couldn't help her husband with the household chores, and worried she'd become a burden on him. When Lou opened the door, she saw an elderly man carrying a basket. "You don't know me," he introduced himself, "but I'm Comrade Zhu, your husband's assistant chief of the guards at the garment factory." "Come in," Lou said. "Would you like some water?" She led him to the kitchen and began to boil water. "I'm worried about your family," the colleague said. "I don't know how you can survive on your husband's salary." Lou remembered the walk from church on empty stomachs when little Doll suggested they declare a day of fast because they had no food. "I believe your husband brings these hard times upon himself," he said, "because he insists on his radical ideas of attending church every week." The water boiled. With difficulty, Lou poured some into a teacup. Mr. Zhu sipped the steamy liquid. "I think you and your husband need to have a long talk. If he stops clinging to his superstitious nonsense, he'll have the money he needs to provide you with medical care. You're only going to get worse. Who will take care of you? Think of your future. Your husband can't, or won't, all because of his feudalistic concepts about some friend he calls Jesus." Lou remembered how she had resented Christianity at first. When her husband sent little Sister Suwang away and devoted himself solely to her and the children, she had accepted his choice for him, but not for herself. However, she had seen the changes in her husband and allowed him to study the Bible with her. She had accompanied him to church when she felt able, but she hadn't considered Christianity for herself until after she had developed the tuberculosis symptoms. The church members had come regularly to give her medicine and warm clothes when Mr. Wang had been too poor to buy them. Their kindness and her husband's separation from Suwang tipped the scales in favor of her becoming a Christian at some future date. She admired her husband's firmness in his beliefs. "I'm afraid for your husband," the assistant interrupted Lou's reverie. "By resisting the will of the people, he's traveling down a very dangerous road." Lou suspected that this was a veiled threat. Her guest reached for the basket and said, "Ayya, I almost forgot to give you this." She looked inside and saw that it was full of chicken and duck eggs. "I want to show you that the government cares," he said, betraying to Lou the fact that he was a party member. "We know Comrade Wang doesn't earn enough to buy eggs, so we bought these for you." "Thank you, but you didn't have to," she said politely. Nevertheless, she took the basket when he insisted. She knew he wouldn't give her something unless he wanted to purchase her emotions or curry favor from her. This was only the beginning. He would present scarce commodities in abundance, hoping she would return the favor. It was an old Chinese custom. On his way out the door, he paused. "I believe you have a good chance to influence your husband. With your wifely wiles, you can dissuade him from pursuing his feudalistic path, which will surely lead him to hell." Then he lowered his voice. "I really need your help, because the communists assigned me to change his mind, but he's so stubborn. They're suspicious I'm too old to be a revolutionary, even though I accompanied Chairman Mao on the Long March, so they may terminate my membership in the party. I want to remain a member, so please talk to your husband. Persuade him to give up God for me." After her guest left, Lou felt disgusted. Comrade Zhu was an old man. Her traditional instincts told her to respect him, but her initial sympathy vanished when she saw his selfishness. The basket of eggs hadn't been a show of government concern for the family. The intent was to turn wives against their husbands, one of the signs her husband had told her that signified the end of time. The basket of eggs was actually a form of persecution. It placed pressure on her to join the Marxist class warfare against her husband. She compared his actions to that of the church members. When they became aware of her tuberculosis and their family's inability to afford health care, even after government discounts, they gave money. Their gifts, given from the heart, begged nothing in return, even though she wasn't a church member. Happily, the eggs were hers regardless. She cracked a few over her wok and laboriously stir-fried them into some rice. When her husband arrived, he helped her serve the meal. Lee and the girls joined them. As he ate, she told him, "Your assistant chief of the guards came by and asked me to urge you to join the government and forget God. He gave us a basket of eggs. That's why you're eating eggs in your rice today." Mr. Wang scowled and rolled his eyes. She knew he didn't like the government encroaching on his religious freedom. "You have no way," she cautioned. "Today's visit is just another warning of trouble. But I'm your wife." She meant she supported him in what he thought to be right. Mr. Wang lifted his bowl of fried rice and duck egg to his chin, shoveling the food into his mouth with his chopsticks. From the top of his eye, he saw his children eating in the same manner. The meal was one of the best the family had eaten since payday. The government was closing in on him. If he didn't change, the party would tighten its pressure. He shuddered, wondering, as his wife's health deteriorated to the point of leaving her bedridden, how he could care for her. He knew that by normal standards, he would not have enough money to support his family unless he gave up his God. That he could never do. Somehow, the real God he trusted would provide a way for his family to survive. The end of chapter 9 of the man who couldn't be killed.